After World War II, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were established in order to give money to countries that were harmed from the war, such as Germany. Their governments and their economies were completely destroyed after the war. So their job at first was to help reconstruct the economies and give them money to provide them goods and services to come back on track. And they were supposed to promote financial stability. In the 1970s, however, neoliberal policies escalated due to a break from the Bretton Woods Institution, which was where the World Bank and IMF were originally established in New Hampshire. And in the 1970s, government deregulation, liberal trade policies, and governmental policies were established. And this is when the World Bank and the IMF institutions began to give loans to third world nations. And what they would do is, in order to make a profit, they would put harsh conditions on the loans, so that they're also called structural adjustment programs. And it would try to supposedly develop countries and make them more market-oriented. And it would leave the markets very vulnerable because these countries couldn't pay back the loans when such high interest rates were attached to the loans. When countries are struggling to begin with, how can you expect them to pay for a loan and then plus interest rate on top of it? So it makes it very difficult, and it actually suppressed the third world people, the indigenous citizens. And as a result of all of that, countries were trying to fight the political elite, but it's very difficult to do so. And with the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995, didn't make it any easier, because they joined with the World Bank and the IMF and increased the trade liberalization and government deregulation with the third world. So as a result, up until today, the global north has brutally imperialized the global south just to make a profit. And the global north has privatized the global commons, which is something that I will be discussing tonight. The global commons consist of food, water, it could be healthcare, it could be labor, education, but I primarily focus on water and food, as well as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the globalization of the banking industry. So I feel like that's where my passion lies. And as a result of all of this, it led to that big inequality gap between the rich and the poor. Back to my topic. The first global commons that I will be talking about tonight is water. And okay, so water is one of the most necessary commons that we need to survive. Without water, we don't have life. It sustains all of us as human beings. And access to a clean, healthy water supply should be a basic human right. And under international human rights law, it says that everyone has access to clean, affordable, free water. But corporations, they don't regard international law, and they do whatever they want because with money comes power. And if they make a profit on people, they feel like they can control people and suppress people that are not as powerful as they are. And there were two cases where two private corporations globalized water. One was in El Alto, Bolivia, and that was with the Swedish corporation, and another one was Bolivia versus Bechtel Corporation. I will first begin by talking about El Alto, Bolivia, and the Swedish corporation. The Swedish corporation was established in 1997, and they privatized the water supply strictly in El Alto, Bolivia. And the Swedish company, they refused to bring an abundance of water to Bolivia, but they told them that they were going to bring great quality of life to them and supply them with a great water supply and make a great community. And they signed a contract with the Bolivian government. And at this time, during 1997 and into part of the 2000s, the president of Bolivia, Sanchez de Lozada, he was the president, and he was very much into privatization of goods, and he was into big corporations because he himself was a businessman and he wanted to strive to make the biggest profit. So as a result of this, he signed the contract, didn't care what the corporations did with the water. And as a result, 20,000 people were left without water in El Alto, and the majority of the people that lived in El Alto only made roughly $60 a month. But the connection fees with the water company, they were going to charge $445 per month for people to access water. And people couldn't afford it because their profits, like per month, their income was only $60. So, as a result, in 2005, there were several riots in the streets of El Alto, and they were by the indigenous Bolivian citizens, and they forced the Suez Corporation to eradicate the contract because they were trying to stop the problem and make a better lives for themselves. And as a group of people, they came together on the streets and protested. And some of the protests, unfortunately, didn't end so nice. There was a lot of death and a lot of suffering, but they fought for what they believed in, and they were successful. And the public water supply, that was their goal. And when Sanchez de Lozada was kicked out of office, Evo Mendez, he was the new president, and he really represented the people more than Sanchez. He was for the public services and the public water supply, and he believed that everybody should have public water and clean, affordable water. And he was against commoditization of goods. So he granted the wishes of all of the indigenous citizens. The second company that also went into Bolivia, they infiltrated, was the Bechtel Corporation. And they're located in San Francisco, that's their headquarters, but they're also located in Canada as well. They have a couple of different companies. And they claimed as well that their company would improve the quality of life and help communities that they were involved with. And on their website, because I did some extensive research, I saw that they actually wrote this on their website, that they help people improve life. But it's just the opposite. They're lying to the people, because in 2000, Bechtel and this company that's owned by Bechtel, they're called Aguas del Tunari. They were successful in taking over the water supply in Cochabamba. It's a city in Bolivia. And as a result, that happened under Sanchez de Lozada. And of course, he allowed it to happen. Water rates, just like with the Suez Corporation, the water rates skyrocketed approximately by 50%. People couldn't afford to pay for water. And again, citizens were still protesting this company as well. And there were even protests in San Francisco and in DC. So we had people in this country who saw what was going on in Bolivia and made a difference in this country by showing what was going on worldwide. Because oftentimes the media will not capture these types of incidences because they feel it's not important and they want to keep us suppressed. They don't want us to know the real truth. And there's one person who I admire deeply. Her name is Maud Barlow, and she attacks the World Water Council. They pretty much control all of, they set the rules for the world water standards, and she attacks them because they're behind supporting all of these corporations and institutions. So she's from Canada, I believe Toronto, and she speaks openly about this topic all over the world. She's been to different countries, and she's made a difference wherever she goes, and she has followers every day following her and supporting her, which is what you need in order to make a difference in society. One of the other global commons I will be discussing today is the food crisis. And a brief definition that I wanted to address is food totalitarianism. It's when corporations take complete control over indigenous farmers' land in the global south. And what the corporations do is they destroy local business by doing so. There was one case, well, in general, I focused on India because I read a book by Vandana Shiva. She's from India, and she addressed the issue and wrote a book called The Stolen Harvest. And it talks all about the Indian food crisis and how trade liberalization by Monsanto and what was something called the Blue Revolution affected India's markets and food sources. What Monsanto did, they're a big company, they're from the United States, but they're also in different parts of the world. They made a seed, it's a hybrid seed, and for example, they'll make a crop, and they'll take this crop and replace it with natural indigenous crops that are in India or other global south countries. And the hybrid seed oftentimes needs to be sprayed with a pesticide or an herbicide in order to grow. So without the pesticide, the crops can't grow. But Monsanto tells the people in the third world that you need this crop because it's better for you, it'll grow quicker, you'll have a better crop. With the weather that you've been having, your crops aren't doing as well. This crop will be a lot better. And they're very good, at advertising, and they trick the people in India, and oftentimes the people would take the crop because they wanted to make a better life for themselves, so they grew this horrible hybrid crop. And oftentimes it would be corn or wheat, that's like the form of the crop. And the pesticide that was used on the crop, there's something in it called glyphosate, and it's a chemical that is known to cause cancer, infertility rates. It's just very bad for your health. It causes a lot of health problems, according to different various scientists who have studied this. And since the hybrid crops weren't native, eventually the crops they didn't grow in India, so a lot of farmers were starving, and unfortunately a lot of them committed suicide or became very depressed because they felt that they had no hope. So back to my speech. That was Monsanto, but there's something else about Monsanto I wanted to discuss. And Monsanto also is, they took over a lot of other companies. 3 that I know of is Cargill, Calgene, and Agricitas. And the 4th one is Unilever. They're all seed corporations that Monsanto took over. So Monsanto is a huge company. And they gained power under the TRIPS agreement of the World Trade Organization in January of 1995. And the TRIPS agreement is a multinational agreement that gave corporations complete control over intellectual property rights, meaning that these corporations were claiming foreign indigenous crops as their own. And under the TRIPS agreement of the World Trade Organization, it was completely legal, in their opinion. And what they would do is Monsanto would take the crop and patent it, so that nobody else could have control of the crop. And Monsanto was infamous for having the coexistence of crops, meaning that they would take hybrid crops and put them with natural crops so that the natural crops would actually become affected and the pesticides would rub off on them. So any crop that was in that farmland or in that country could be contaminated, which is a problem because some people think the crop is natural, they go to eat it and there's pesticides on it, and then down the line maybe they develop cancer or something severely dangerous to their health. And they might not have known why at that point. And Monsanto's Roundup Ready, that was the glyphosate chemical, they used it on all of these crops. And just to show how powerful Monsanto is, there was a court case, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it, but it was the Percy Schmeiser case in Canada. And what happened was that Percy Schmeiser, he was a farmer in Canada, and he was growing his own crop farm. And Monsanto came in and claimed that Percy's crops were actually Monsanto's crops. They said that he used one of our seeds and was growing crops that were not indigenous to Canada. So Percy Schmeiser went to the Canadian Supreme Court against Monsanto, and Canadian Supreme Court actually ruled with Monsanto. They said that it was Monsanto's crop first because Monsanto had the patent, they had all the paperwork needed to show that it was theirs, but in reality it was Percy's. So he couldn't fight it through the law, and as a result, people did protest because they went to the court case, they saw what happened, but the Canadian Supreme Court backed the corporation. And now to talk about the marine life and blue revolution. But before I get into that, I forgot I wanted to bring up something with Monsanto and corporations like Monsanto. As some of you may know, in India, cattle is sacred to Hindu culture. The cow is sacred, and oftentimes corporations do not care about religious beliefs or any spiritual beliefs. And what they do is corporations allow animal abuse, especially with cows, by continuing to allow industries to control how much milk a cow can produce. And what they'll do is they'll over-milk the cow, which causes the cow to eventually lose weight, and it's unhealthy for the cow. And cows they're animals, they're living beings, and I think we should respect any living being, just like we respect ourselves. And what they'll do is they'll feed cattle high diets in protein, but cattle necessarily, they're supposed to have green diets, meaning they eat grass, wheat, things that you can grow as crops. These corporations, what they'll do is they'll inject hormones into the meat, and they get away with not labeling foods. And there's this policy called the right to know policy with labeling, and it's ignored by corporations. So they'll start sending out products and giving them to food stores, but they don't label what's actually in the product. If there's genetically modified, products in that piece of food, people don't know because it's not labeled. So they'll be eating foods that have genetically modified organisms on them, in them. And that's actually happening here in the United States as well with Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. There are two big food stores that they purchase foods from different companies, and the foods are not labeled properly. They're not telling you that there's genetically modified organisms in the crop. They're not telling you that there's pesticides used to grow the crop. And it came out on the news, and as of next year, they're claiming that they're going to start labeling all of their foods and say that they're genetically modified or they have certain chemicals in them. But we'll see if that comes to fruition. But I just wanted to pass out something. I interned at Assemblyman Al Graff's office with Doug, and there was a bill that was going around regarding genetically modified foods, which it's supposed to stop the genetically modified crops from being grown in New York, especially because there are crops grown here that have pesticides on them that aren't healthy, and they have chemicals that obviously can cause health problems. And it talks about the contamination of foods and the labeling of foods. So I was going to pass this around to let you look at it. I think it's interesting because it's something that's happening right here in New York where we live. And everything starts local and then builds outward, globally. So I think it's good to look at something that's local, that relates to this global crisis. And back to my presentation, I was just going to talk about briefly the marine life and blue revolution. What this relates to is overfishing that depletes the supply in the ecosystem. And when you overfish, obviously other animals that are in the food chain become affected from it. And there was one example was with shrimp farming, and it wasn't successful in the United States. And I don't know why corporations would think it would be successful in other countries, but they tried it anyway. And it's considered a rape and run industry because corporations will profit from it, and as soon as they profit from it, they'll take the profits and run. So now there's people that are affected by this, and they're still in poverty and they have no way of getting out of it. And the corporations turn their back on the indigenous citizens. Industries in India especially, they replaced mangroves with shrimp farms, and mangroves they're areas where animals live, it's kind of like their natural green habitat. And they replaced them with shrimp farms, which it's kind of like when you get food from a store like salmon, for example, they're farm raised. It's kind of like the same thing with shrimp farming. They're farm raised shrimp that aren't from the wild. And it destroys natural habitat. And since the shrimp are kept in such confined sections in this farm, oftentimes they're living in really disgusting conditions. And it doesn't help the shrimp, and it doesn't help people that are eating the shrimp. It's filled with contamination and pollution. And it causes increases in death because of what's in the shrimp and what the people are eating. And it causes groundwater pollution, and it's an issue for both the shrimp and the people as living beings. And with this, water scarcity has occurred because of so much contamination. A lot of the water supply was contaminated from this because of groundwater pollution, that the water supply that was available to people in India was becoming contaminated as a result of it. And trees were cut down, farms were replaced with them, and these farms obviously they're using chemicals, so it's not a natural habitat. And people need to migrate further to get access to clean water and natural goods. So it makes their lives more difficult because they have to travel further now to get access to natural food. Under the Blue Revolution, this was when the Transgenic Fish came about. It's a hybrid fish that is altered by corporations, and it allows the fish to grow 10 times faster than a normal fish. And oftentimes they'll use a chemical called the AF protein, and it's by a company, they title themselves the AF Protein Company. Hi, how are you?
Good, hi.
And what happens is that with this protein, it's also, the protein is injected with something called BioGrow, and that's what causes the Atlantic salmon to grow so much more and then consume so much more, which affects the ecosystem. BioGrow is also known for causing sterilization of both males and females, not just with humans, but also with the fish that are being injected with it, and it stunts muscle growth. So it causes the Frankenstein effect is what they call it. And I have a little cartoon here regarding the Frankenstein effect. It's just pretty much altering a natural being and turning it into something else by altering physical features and internal features. So it's causing an unnatural balance in the human body. Okay, this is one of the slides. slide for this one, but I'll just speak about it. It's who's challenging the global food crisis. And there's all different institutions, or civil society groups, I should say, that are doing it. One is the Institute for Food and Development Policy. They're located in the United States, and they spoke out against poverty and health hazards caused by the global elite with the genetically modified organisms. There's also the Food First, which is a think tank by New York Times, and they pushed for food sovereignty in the global south, and they want to end food discrimination, and they want to push for biodiversity, meaning that the crops are biodiverse and they're all natural and they're individually unique crops. And they're, the New York Times is part of them as well. They're a think tank. And later on I'll be discussing the World Social Forum, but they're the biggest world global civil society movement, and they allow for an open forum of food hijacking. Another example would be the landless workers movement. They're trying to fight against the global elite taking their land and privatizing it, and to stop colonizing different parts of the world that don't belong to them. It's not indigenous to them. And they want to see pure democracy instilled in the use of land, the use of products. They want people to be able to have the right to say yes or no to something that's occurring in their country as a result of the open market crisis. And the last one that's also attacking the food crisis is the National Alliance for Women's Foods Rights. They focus strictly on food rights, and they are openly pushing for farmers' rights, indigenous farmers, and consumer choice, because they want consumers to be able to pick and choose what types of foods that they can eat, and not be forced to eat something because a corporation says it's good for you. And they brought, a lot of times, the National Alliance for Women's Foods Rights, they brought the case to the Indian Supreme Court. They'll bring cases to the Indian Supreme Court to continue to try to fight against genetically modified crops, such as soybeans that were introduced by Monsanto that aren't indigenous to Indians, and they're not used to eating a soybean diet, so it alters their body because it's not something that they're accustomed to. So they're pushing to try to end that. How the global commons were affected by NAFTA. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it was established in 1994, and it was an agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico to establish a trade alliance. And there's pros and cons of NAFTA, and the pros of NAFTA don't always benefit both the global north and the global south. It can benefit one or the other. So I'm going to go through the different pros and cons. I guess starting off with the pros. One of the pros was the tariffs that were instilled, and one of the primary advantages was the reduction of taxes on the goods that were being distributed between the three countries, so that it would make it cheaper for each country to trade with one another, technically. But there were often times where Canada would still try to tax sugar, poultry, eggs, and dairy products on Mexico. So these tariffs didn't always make it easier for the countries to trade, because with tax on it, it's not benefiting Mexico. It's making it more expensive to buy it. But in other instances, with domestic production, the tariffs that were between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, it would make it cheaper for them than, say, another country to come and trade with the Triangle Alliance. It would be better off for another country in Europe, let's just say, to make a domestic product and not trade it with the Triangle, because it would be cheaper for them to just produce it at home. So that's a pro, I guess, for, you could say, for NAFTA in a way. Also for Texas economy, because Texas is on the border of Mexico, a lot of times the goods that are being distributed through Texas from Mexico, it would boost the Texas economy, so that was a pro for America in that case. And domestic production relates to, as I said before, with the tariffs and how it's cheaper for the countries. It's more expensive for countries outside of the Triangle to trade with them, because they'd rather just trade and do with products at home in, let's just say, Europe, for example. However, the negative impacts would be job losses and illegal immigration. There was a lot of job losses for Mexican farmers as a result of NAFTA. Oftentimes because of Mexico's liberal market policies in energy, finance, and industry due to NAFTA, the demands for Canada and US goods, they increased, which made Mexico more dependent on the global north, because what would happen is that Canada and the United States would send so many imports to Mexico that they were kind of bombarded with crops, and they used the crops that were sent to them, and the crops that were being exported there was less of. So kind of infiltrated their economy in that case. And Mexico, as a result, suffered from an increasing trade deficit because Mexico's imports were higher than their exports. And it caused a decrease in real wages and decent paying jobs for a lot of Mexican farmers. And with illegal immigration, because a lot of people living in Mexico felt they had no hope, that it was really hard for them to make a living, a lot of times they illegally came to the United States. Between roughly 1990 and 2000, there was a big infiltration because of NAFTA. And the amount of illegal immigrants at that point had doubled. And it was a disadvantage, in that case, for both sides of the spectrum. It could be a disadvantage for Mexico as well as for the United States in certain aspects. And I also want to touch upon the globalization of banks. And what this includes is the globalization of United States banks in foreign countries as well as foreign banks in the United States. So prior to 1978, foreign banks in the United States were completely unregulated. And they were able to branch across state lines and were more privileged than domestic banks in America. But because of the International Banking Act of 1978, foreign banks were now under the same federal regulations as domestic banks in the U.S. So the grandfather provision, which was it was called the Grandfather Provision Act, it allowed foreign banks to keep illegal interstate branches during that time. So therefore, interstate banking and securities restrictions, which is like selling or buying like stocks or bonds, it only applied to new foreign banks that were operating after 1978. So that International Banking Act of 1978 only applied to the new banks that were opened after 1978. So the solution is active groups, also known as civil society groups, or, do you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Civil society groups, that's what they're referred to. One of the biggest ones that I mentioned before is the World Social Forum, and the Global Call to Action, GCAP. She's very big into the world water crisis, People's Health Movement, and National Women's Alliance for the food rights. And in my opinion, the solution is a balanced state. I'm actually taking a class right now with Dr. McGlone, and he introduced this threefold structure to us based off of Rudolf Steiner. And I know Henry George also touches upon this topic as well. And it's the threefold state where you have the economic sector, which is cooperation and brotherhood, meaning that instead of people like making big profits at the expense of other people, in this case it would be people working together and making profits while helping each other. And no one is suppressed necessarily. You have people that can make a good living and make profits, but they're helping people as a result. And one example of this that I can give off the top of my head is the Zappos shoe company, as well as Tom's. I know they're another company. And what they do is for every X amount of dollars that you spend on shoes or anything on their website, they give a percentage back to people in the global south, in different developing countries. So that's a way of making a profit and being a good business person and helping people at the same time. And they have actually helped people who are struggling. So it shows that there is a right way and a wrong way to conduct business globally. One of the other sections is culture, which is freedom. It's the freedom to, have arts, sciences, anything that you could do on like research basis or just being with other people. It's just having freedom and equality, which also stems into rights, which is polity, government, and laws. I think like they kind of relate to culture and freedom because you have justice, liberty, freedom, anything that you could do what you want and help others at the same time. And I think Rudolf Steiner had a great message, and I think all of us should look at this system and see if we can come to a conclusion or a solution to help it. And that's the end of my presentation.